Okay, let's go. Number 1. The Sibylline Books. The year is 83 BCE. You are a Roman priest, assigned to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. You arrive at dawn for the morning observances and find the great bronze doors already open. Inside, where the most sacred documents in Rome are kept, the prophecies that have guided the Republic through plague, war, and catastrophe for 4 centuries, there is nothing but ash. The Temple of Jupiter burned in the night. The last 3 surviving books of the Sibylline collection are gone, but that is not where the real loss happened. The real loss happened more than a century earlier, in a field outside Cumae, when a woman offered Rome 9 books of prophecy, and a king refused to pay. The story is this. An old woman came to the court of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, carrying 9 books. She claimed they contained the fate of Rome, the future of the city, written out in full. She named her price. The king refused, certain she was asking too much. She built a fire in front of him and burned 3 of the books. Then she offered the remaining 6 at the same original price for all 9. He refused again. She burned 3 more. Then she offered the last 3 at the original price for all 9. Tarquinius paid. She took the money and walked away. No one ever saw her again. She was the Cumaean Sibyl, the prophetess of Apollo. The 3 books she sold were installed in the Temple of Jupiter and guarded as a state secret. They were not read for instruction or entertainment. They were consulted only when Rome faced something it could not otherwise interpret: plague, military catastrophe, a rain of blood, a river running backward. A priestly college, the Quindecimviri Sacris Faciundis, held sole authority to open the books. The contents were never publicly revealed. Livy documents their use across 4 centuries of Republican history. They were consulted before the Second Punic War. They sanctioned the importation of the cult of Cybele from Phrygia in 205 BCE, a decision that reshaped Roman religion. Dionysius of Halicarnassus, writing in the 1st century BCE, confirmed that the books were treated as the single most authoritative religious document in Roman history. Then, 83 BCE, the fire. The 3 books were gone. Rome's response was extraordinary. The Senate dispatched delegations to Erythrae in Asia Minor, to Samos, to Sicily, and to Troy, to gather whatever surviving Sibylline oracles could be found. They collected approximately 1,000 lines of verse from memory and from other prophetic traditions. A new collection was assembled, kept in the rebuilt temple, and consulted through the imperial period. The Emperor Augustus later had around 2,000 spurious verses removed. The reconstructed collection was used into the 5th century CE. Then, in 405 CE, the Roman general Stilicho, about to be executed, accused of treason, ordered what remained burned. 3 years later, Rome was sacked by the Visigoths for the first time in 8 centuries. The conventional explanation is that the Sibylline books were political instruments. Oracles, flexible enough to sanction whatever the Senate needed, consulted selectively, no more prophetically reliable than any other ancient religious text. The fire in 83 BCE was a disaster, but the reconstruction was workable. Stilicho's burning was theater. The books mattered as ceremony, not prophecy. But that explanation says nothing about the 6 books the Sibyl burned herself. Those 6 books are the real loss. They were never Rome's. They were destroyed by the Sibyl, deliberately, because Tarquinius refused to pay her price. No reconstruction could touch them. They were gone before Rome's history began. What did those 6 books contain that was worth burning, rather than selling cheaply? Why did the Sibyl consider them more dangerous in Roman hands than in ash? If the 3 surviving books were enough to guide Rome through 4 centuries of crisis, what would the full 9 have changed? And who, exactly, was the old woman who walked out of Cumae and never came back? Number 2. The Books of Numa. The year is 181 BCE. A farm worker is plowing a field on the Janiculum Hill outside Rome when his plow strikes something solid 12 feet below the surface. He digs. He finds 2 stone chests. One contains human bones. The other contains 14 books, perfectly preserved after more than 5 centuries underground, wrapped in waxed cloths, packed in citrus wood boxes, sealed against moisture and decay. The bones belong to Numa Pompilius, Rome's 2nd king. The books are his. 7 of the books are written in Latin on pontifical law. 7 are written in Greek on Pythagorean philosophy. The The praetor Quintus Petilius Spirinus reads them. Then he brings them before the Roman Senate. The Senate votes to burn them publicly in the Comitium, every copy, that same day. Livy records this in Book 40 of his history. He is not recording a legend. He is recording a dated political event, a named magistrate, a named location, a specific count of books, a recorded justification. The Senate's reasoning, as Livy preserves it. The books contained ideas destructive to Roman religion. Valerius Maximus adds that they were judged capable of undermining the divine authority of Rome's religious institutions. Those institutions had been founded by Numa himself. Numa Pompilius was not simply a king, he was Rome's religious architect. Tradition credited him with establishing the calendar, founding the priestly colleges, instituting the Vestal Virgins, and organizing the entire system of Roman sacred law that still governed religious life 500 years after his death. His Latin books on pontifical law were presumably the foundation documents of that very system. The Senate voted to burn a religion's founding texts because those texts undermined the religion built on them. The 7 Greek books are harder to explain. Numa died around 673 BCE by traditional dating. Pythagoras was born around 570 BCE, roughly a century later. If these books genuinely contained Pythagorean philosophy and genuinely dated to Numa's era, they recorded ideas that predated the man who gave them his name. Plutarch, writing the life of Numa in the 1st century CE, addressed this directly. He proposed 3 possibilities. The books were later forgeries planted in the chest. Numa had access to an older Pythagorean tradition that preceded the historical philosopher, or the Pythagorean label was a gloss added to whatever Numa had actually written. No ancient scholar could resolve the question. The Senate resolved it with fire before anyone had time to. What strikes hardest about this story is the preservation. Whoever buried those chests wanted the books to survive. Waxed cloths against moisture, citrus wood against insects, 12 feet of compacted earth against casual discovery. Someone took extraordinary care over these books. They lasted 5 centuries underground intact, and within days of their recovery, they were ash. Plutarch notes that some sources claimed Numa himself had requested the books be buried with him rather than transmitted publicly, knowing they were too dangerous to circulate. If that is true, then the Senate's decision honored his wishes. He had chosen burial over transmission, and the Senate chose fire over burial. But that logic collapses under scrutiny. If Numa wanted the books suppressed, why write 14 of them? Why preserve them so meticulously? And if the Senate found them capable of destroying religion, it means they found ideas that, written by the man who built that religion, could still bring it down from the inside. The Senate didn't burn the books because they were false. They burned them because they were afraid they were true. What Pythagorean ideas were dangerous enough to destroy after a single reading? Did Numa's philosophy contain a cosmology that undercut the divine authority of Roman priesthood written, impossibly, by the man who invented that priesthood? And who, in the Senate or on the Janiculum Hill, read those 7 Greek books in full and understood exactly what Rome was losing? Number 3. The Mayan Codices. July 12th, 1562. The town of Mani, Yucatan. You are standing in the central plaza watching Bishop Diego de Landa supervise the burning. The pile in front of you is not weapons or contraband. It is books. Thousands of pages of painted fig bark paper, folded accordion style, covered in intricate hieroglyphs and illustrations. Calendars. Medical knowledge. Astronomical tables. The entire intellectual inheritance of a civilization, stacked in a plaza and lit on fire, while the people who could read them weep. De Landa wrote about this later. We found great numbers of books in these characters, and as they contained nothing in which were not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them great affliction. He noted the affliction as a curiosity, not a warning. Before the Spanish conquest, the Maya possessed thousands of screenfold codices made from fig bark paper, each one a repository of accumulated knowledge. They recorded astronomical cycles, agricultural almanacs, ritual calendars, medical treatments, genealogies of ruling dynasties, and histories of cities. The scribes who produced them, the Atzib, the ones who write, were among the most respected members of Maya society. A single roll could contain decades of systematic observation. A full library represented centuries. Delanda's auto-da-fe at Mani destroyed an estimated 5,000 idols and 27 hieroglyphic rolls. Each roll could contain hundreds of pages. The witnesses, according to Delanda's own account, wept openly. He interpreted their grief as evidence of the book's demonic hold over them. It did not occur to him that they might be grieving the same way anyone grieves watching an irreplaceable archive burn. 4 Maya codices survived. They survived because they had already been sent to Europe as curiosities before Delanda's burning. The Dresden Codex, now held in the Sächsische Landesbibliothek in Germany, dates to the 13th through 15th centuries. Its Venus almanac tracks the 584-day synodic cycle of Venus with an accumulated error of just 2 hours over 481 years. Its eclipse prediction tables are accurate to within minutes. The Madrid Codex, in the Museo de America in Spain, contains ritual almanacs and agricultural guides. The Paris Codex, in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, preserves prophetic cycles. These 4 books are the only substantial written record of the classical Maya that wasn't chiseled in stone. Everything else Delanda burned. The Maya hieroglyphic script wasn't deciphered until the 1950s through 1980s, beginning with Soviet linguist Yuri Konorazov's breakthrough paper in 1952, and continuing through the collaborative work of Linda Shelley, David Stewart, and their colleagues across 3 decades. By the time scholars had the tools to read Mayan writing, the books that would have accelerated that decipherment by generations were 4 centuries of ash. There is an irony embedded in Delanda's legacy that is almost too sharp to believe. After the burning, he wrote Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán, a detailed account of Maya culture, history, language, and writing, including an attempted documentation of the Maya script. It is now one of the primary sources historians use to understand what was lost. The man who destroyed the Maya written record is also our main guide to what it contained. A 2021 study of the Dresden Codex identified previously unrecognized lunar tables extending eclipse predictions beyond what earlier scholarship had mapped. There may be more in the 4 surviving codices that we haven't yet understood. What the thousands of lost codices contained about Maya medicine, origin mythology, and pre-classic history before 250 CE is entirely unknown. What medical knowledge died in Mani? What did the lost codices say about the Maya's own origins that their stone inscriptions don't? What histories of cities, dynasties, and catastrophes were in those 27 rolls? And would we understand pre-contact Americas differently if a bishop in 1562 had been curious rather than certain? Number 4. The Alchemical Library of Diocletian. The year is 296 CE. You are a Roman soldier in Alexandria, moving through the Mausian district with a torch and orders. You are not looking for seditious pamphlets or Christian scriptures. You have a specific list. Every text teaching how to make gold and silver. Every papyrus. Every tablet, every scroll containing the Egyptian alchemical tradition. Find them all, burn them. The decree is recorded in the Byzantine encyclopedia known as the Suda, compiled in the 10th century from earlier sources. The Suda's entry on Diocletian is specific. He had the books burned so that Egyptians could no longer accumulate wealth through the knowledge of these arts, and use that wealth to finance rebellion against Rome. This was not religious persecution. It was monetary policy enforced with fire. Diocletian inherited an empire in financial collapse. The Roman silver denarius had been so systematically debased over the preceding century that by 270 CE it contained less than 5% actual silver. Prices had increased roughly tenfold in 50 years. Soldiers refused coin payment. Trade had reverted to barter across entire regions. Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices in 301 CE, the most comprehensive attempt at price control in ancient history. It failed, driving goods off the market entirely. Against this background, a tradition that claimed to teach the creation of convincing gold and silver was not an abstract curiosity. It was an economic weapon. The Egyptian alchemical tradition was the oldest systematic body of knowledge about the transformation of metals in the ancient world. Dating to the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, it emerged from the confluence of Greek philosophy, Egyptian priestly knowledge, and practical metallurgy in Hellenistic Alexandria. Two fragments survived Diocletian's purge because they were buried in a tomb at Thebes, not stored in a library. The Leyden papyrus and the Stockholm papyrus, both discovered in 1828. They contain detailed recipes for making metals and gemstones resemble gold, silver, and precious stones, methods for creating counterfeits sophisticated enough that buyers couldn't reliably distinguish them from genuine articles. Zosimos of Panopolis, writing around 300 CE, is the earliest alchemist known by name. He worked in the immediate aftermath of Diocletian's purge. His surviving texts, collected as the Characmeta, are filled with complaints about books he cannot find, works he attributes to figures like Maria the Jewess, Cleopatra, the alchemist, and Ostanes. He is reconstructing a tradition from fragments and memory. He knows what's missing. The conventional explanation is that Diocletian's targeting was rational and narrow. The counterfeiting recipes destabilized currency already barely functioning. The emperor eliminated that specific threat. Nothing more mysterious. But the Leyden and Stockholm papyri, the survivors, contain the counterfeiting recipes. If Diocletian's soldiers had burned all the alchemical books systematically, these are exactly the texts that should have been destroyed. They weren't, because they were in a tomb, not a library. What the soldiers actually reached and destroyed was something else. The theoretical foundations, the cosmological frameworks, the texts that Zosimos references and cannot find. The works that situated Egyptian metallurgy within a larger understanding of matter, transformation, and the nature of substances. This is the tradition that fed into medieval European alchemy, Islamic chemistry, and ultimately the conceptual groundwork that preceded modern chemistry. We have the counterfeiting recipes. We are missing the theory. What was in the theoretical texts that Diocletian found more threatening than the fake gold recipes he failed to destroy? Were there alchemical methods for something beyond metal pharmaceutical preparations, material processes we haven't imagined? What did Zosimos mean when he described books so foundational that losing them made the rest of the tradition incomprehensible? And what exactly did the Egyptian priestly tradition know about matter that took Western science another 15 centuries to begin working out? Number 5. The Gospel of Eve. Picture a library in 4th century Alexandria. The shelves hold books that will soon be illegal to own. A monk is copying texts as fast as he can, choosing which ones to preserve and which to leave behind. He cannot save everything. He seals what he has saved in a clay jar and buries it in a hillside near Nag Hammadi. Then he leaves. The jar sits there for 16 centuries. In 375 CE, a bishop named Epiphanius of Salamis published the Panarion, a catalogue of 80 Christian heresies, each described in enough detail to be refuted. In his account of a group he calls the Fibionites, Epiphanius quotes directly from a text they used, the Gospel of Eve. The quote reads, "I stood on a high mountain, and saw a tall man and a short man, and heard something like the sound of thunder, and came closer to listen. And he spoke to me and said, I am you, and you are me. And wherever you are, I am there. And I am sown in all things. And wherever you wish, you gather me. And in gathering me, you gather yourself." The quote survives. The book does not. Epiphanius preserved it in order to condemn it. He is the Gospel of Eve's only witness, and he is hostile. We know the book existed because its enemy quoted it. No manuscript, no fragment, no separate copy has ever been found. The Fibionites were a Gnostic sect, active in Egypt and Syria, in the 2nd through 4th centuries CE. Gnosticism was not one religion, but a cluster of related movements sharing a set of ideas. The material world was created by an inferior deity. Human beings contained a divine spark from a higher reality. Salvation came through secret knowledge, gnosis, rather than through faith or institutional mediation. Different Gnostic groups produced their own scriptures. The Gospel of Eve belonged to that tradition. Based on the surviving fragment, the text taught a form of divine immanence, the divine not located in a distant heaven, but distributed through creation and present inside every human being. I am sown in all things. This is not the theology of a transcendent creator issuing commandments from outside the universe. It is something structurally different, and Epiphanius clearly understood exactly what it threatened. In December 1945, a farmer near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt broke open a sealed clay jar buried in a hillside and found 13 leather-bound codices containing 52 Gnostic texts. The collection included the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and texts known previously only from condemnations in early church fathers. They had survived because someone buried them around 390 CE, almost certainly to protect them from the persecution. Epiphanius was helping to orchestrate. Everything not buried in that jar was gone. The Gospel of Eve was not in that jar. In 367 CE, Athanasius of Alexandria issued his 39th Festal Letter, the first document to specify exactly the 27 books of the New Testament. Everything outside that list was categorized as heretical or apocryphal. By the late 4th century, under Theodosius I, possession of heretical texts was a criminal offense under Roman law. The institutional pressure to destroy or stop copying Gnostic literature was total. The Nag Hammadi discovery proved the destruction was working. 52 texts survived by accident, buried in a hillside. The rest did not survive at all. If the Gospel of Eve was theologically wrong, it could have been refuted. It was instead erased. The question is not theological, it is historical. What did the full Gospel of Eve contain beyond the one fragment Epiphanius preserved? What did its cosmology say about creation, about the nature of the divine, about what it meant to be human? Why was a single sentence, a voice saying, "I am you, and you are me," considered dangerous enough to require the destruction of the entire book? And what else was in the jars that no one buried in time? Number 6. The Book of the Wars of the Lord. Open the book of Numbers, chapter 21, verse 14. The Israelites are moving through the Transjordan during the wilderness period. The text is describing territorial boundaries and river locations. Then, mid-sentence, it stops and says, "Therefore it is said in the book of the wars of the Lord." Stop. The Bible is citing another book as a source, a book called the Book of the Wars of the Lord, a book that no longer exists. This is not a reference to a story or a prophecy or a theological tradition. It is a geographical footnote. The author of Numbers is using the Book of the Wars of the Lord the same way a historian uses an existing reference to corroborate a location, in this case the Arnon River and Israel's territorial boundaries during the Exodus. The book was apparently well known enough that citing it required no explanation. The reader was expected to understand the reference. No one has found it, no fragment, no quotation in any other source, no manuscript in any collection in the world. Just this one citation, preserved inside the text, that made it unnecessary. The Book of the Wars of the Lord appears to have been a collection of battle poetry and victory songs commemorating Israelite military campaigns during the wilderness period, the same era Numbers describes. Scholars date the final composition of Numbers to somewhere between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE, but the embedded material, including the war's poetry, is generally considered much older. The Book of the Wars of the Lord may predate the earliest layers of the written Torah. The biblical authors were reaching back to use a source older than their own text. It is not alone. The Hebrew Bible references at least 20 texts that no longer exist. The Book of Jasher is cited in Joshua 10:13 and 2 Samuel 1:18. The Book of the Acts of Solomon appears in 1 Kings 11:41. The Annals of the Kings of Israel and the Annals of the Kings of Judah are referenced repeatedly across Kings and Chronicles as sources for royal history. In 2 Chronicles 9:29, the compiler mentions the visions of Iddo, the seer. In Numbers 21:27, there is a reference to those who speak in proverbs, pointing toward an entire genre of proverbial literature now gone. The surviving Hebrew Bible is not the complete literature of ancient Israel. It is the selection that editors, across multiple centuries, chose to keep copying. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd discovered clay jars in a cave near the Dead Sea. The discovery eventually yielded approximately 900 manuscripts from the caves of Qumran, some dating to the 3rd century BCE, older than any previously known biblical manuscript. The Dead Sea Scrolls included multiple copies of most biblical books, previously unknown sectarian texts, and psalms, hymns, and legal documents not found in the canon. None of the referenced lost books appeared. The Book of the Wars of the Lord was not in the caves at Qumran. The scholarly consensus is that the Book of the Wars of the Lord simply stopped being copied because it wasn't considered canonical. As the Hebrew scriptural tradition was codified, a process spanning several centuries, editors made decisions about what to transmit. The Book of the Wars was useful enough to cite, but not important enough to reproduce indefinitely. That explanation is probably correct. It is also disturbing in what it implies. The Torah's own authors were using sources. They selected what to include and set the rest aside. The biblical account of the wilderness period is built partly on documents we no longer have. The text's own footnote proves it. What the Book of the Wars of the Lord said about those campaigns, what version of the Exodus exists in the books the editors chose not to copy, is gone. What did the Book of the Wars of the Lord say about the wilderness period that didn't make it into Numbers? If the biblical editors were selecting from a larger literature, what guided those selections? Are any of the 20-plus referenced lost books somewhere in the Dead Sea region, in caves that haven't been excavated? And what would change about our understanding of ancient Israel if we could read the texts its own historians used as sources? Number 7. Aristotle's Second Book of Poetics. In 1980, the Italian novelist Umberto Eco published The Name of the Rose. The central mystery is a series of murders in a medieval monastery, all connected to a single book hidden in the library. Aristotle's Second Book of Poetics, the lost treatise on comedy. The killer, a fanatical elderly monk, poisons the pages. People die for reading it. His reasoning: if Aristotle granted comedy the same philosophical dignity he gave to tragedy, if he argued that laughter produced catharsis just as legitimately as grief, then the entire spiritual authority of an institution built on solemnity would crack. Eco chose this book because its loss is historically documented. The Second Book of Poetics existed, ancient sources confirm it, and no manuscript has ever been found. Aristotle's Poetics was composed around 335 BCE. The first book, which survives, analyzes tragedy, defining it, identifying its structural components, arguing that tragedy produces catharsis through the emotions of pity and fear. It became the most influential text in the history of Western dramatic theory. From the Renaissance forward, every systematic account of storytelling structure has been shaped by it. Aristotle's analysis of what tragedy does to an audience became the template for how Western culture thought about narrative itself. The second book was supposed to do the same thing for comedy. The evidence for its existence is solid. The 6th century commentator Proclus lists both books. The Syriac translation of the Poetics, documented through Arabic references studied by Dimitri Gutas in his 1998 work Greek Thought, Arabic Culture, mentions a second book on comedy. Avicenna's 11th century commentary on the Poetics treats the work as having 2 parts. The book was known as late as the 9th century CE. After that, silence. No medieval European library holds a manuscript. No complete Arabic translation has been found. It may have existed into the 13th century and simply stopped being copied one monastery's decision, one scriptorium's indifference, and the book was effectively dead. What the second book contained is partially, disputedly, preserved. The Tractatus Quaslinianus, a Byzantine summary held in the Quaslin manuscript collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, was analyzed by classicist Richard Janko of the University of Michigan in his 1984 work Aristotle on Comedy. Janko argued that the Tractatus is a compressed summary of the lost second book. If he is correct, Aristotle argued that comedy produces catharsis through pleasure and laughter, a structural parallel to tragedy's catharsis through pity and fear. Comedy was not inferior. It was a different mode of the same fundamental human need. Aristotle, in the lost text, apparently built a systematic defense of the experience of laughing. The transmission failure is where the mystery lives. Aristotle's works survived the Hellenistic period, were preserved in Arabic translation in Baghdad in the 9th century, and returned to Europe through Latin translations in the 12th and 13th centuries. Only the texts that were copied at each stage survived. The first book on tragedy was copied because it was useful for rhetorical training, for theological argument, for the analysis of dramatic and epic forms. The second book on comedy was apparently not copied, because no one found it sufficiently useful, or because someone found it sufficiently dangerous. Aristotle's first book aligned comfortably with Christian ideas of suffering, moral consequence, and spiritual gravity. A philosophical argument that laughter worked just as well, that the comic and the tragic produced equivalent cathartic results, was more complicated for institutions that staked their authority on solemnity. Eco's fictional librarian was dramatizing a real question. Who benefits from comedy being treated as philosophically lesser? Did the church suppress the second book, or did it simply stop being copied because no one assigned it value? Is the Tractatus Quaeslianianus a genuine summary of the lost text, or a later construction? And if Aristotle systematically legitimized comedy, what other philosophical arguments did Western culture decide it could live without? Number 8. The Hermetic Originals. Around 190 CE, Clement of Alexandria, head of the most important Christian school in the Roman world, with access to the greatest library in existence, watched an Egyptian religious procession and wrote down what the leading priests carried. They carried books. 42 of them, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, which Clement said contained all the knowledge of Egypt. He listed the categories: 10 books on the priestly arts and the knowledge of the gods, 10 books on Egyptian sacred law, 10 on hieroglyphics and the cosmography of the world, 4 on astronomy, 4 on astrology, 2 on music, 2 on writing. Today, the Corpus Hermeticum, the surviving body of Hermetic literature, contains 18 tractates, 18 texts of philosophy and mystical dialogue, against the 42 books Clement watched being carried through the streets of Alexandria. Hermes Trismegistus. Thrice greatest Hermes was a syncretic figure merging the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god of wisdom and writing, Thoth. The Hermetic texts emerged from Hellenistic Egypt in the 1st through 3rd centuries CE, out of the same intellectual environment that produced Gnosticism, Neoplatonism, and the alchemical tradition destroyed by Diocletian. Ancient sources routinely treated the books as far older as primordial revelations, predating Moses and Plato, transmitted from a divine source at the beginning of civilization. The Corpus Hermeticum entered Europe in 1460, when a monk traveling in Macedonia brought a Greek manuscript to Florence and delivered it to Cosimo de' Medici, the city's ruler and the greatest patron of scholarship in Italy. Cosimo was at that moment funding the translation of Plato's complete works. When the Hermetic manuscript arrived, he stopped it. He ordered his scholar Marsilio Ficino to put Plato aside and translate Hermes first. Cosimo believed Hermes Trismegistus was more ancient and more urgent than Plato. Ficino's Latin translation was completed in 1463 and circulated throughout Europe, becoming one of the foundational texts of Renaissance philosophy, magic, and science. What the surviving corpus contains is striking. The Poimandres tractate describes a vision of creation, a divine mind, a fall into matter, the entrapment of the human soul, and the possibility of return to the divine source. The Asclepius, preserved in Latin, contains a lament about the future destruction of Egyptian wisdom, a passage so precise it reads as prophecy of its own disappearance. Hermetic texts from the Nag Hammadi library, including the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, describe mystical ascent through the celestial spheres. These are philosophical and cosmological texts. But Clement's list was not primarily philosophical. He described 10 books on Egyptian sacred law, legal frameworks for an entire civilization's governance, 10 books on hieroglyphics and cosmography, a complete system of Egyptian writing and world geography, 4 books on astronomy, and 4 on astrology, systematic celestial knowledge. None of these categories appear in the 18 tractates of the surviving corpus. Ficino translated the mystical core. The practical and technical dimensions, the legal texts, the astronomical tables, the hieroglyphic manuals are not there. The conventional explanation is that the non-philosophical books were in Egyptian rather than Greek, never translated into the language in which texts circulated and survived, and were absorbed into the general destruction of Egyptian institutional knowledge following Christianization and the final closure of the pagan temples in the late 4th and 5th centuries. But Clement saw those books. They existed in 190 CE. The gap between what he described and what we have is not a matter of scholarly debate. It is a matter of arithmetic. Were the legal and medical Hermetic books deliberately excluded from transmission, circulated only within Egyptian priestly communities and never entering the Greek-language scholarly world? Did they die in Diocletian's purge? Are they somewhere in European archives, unidentified, catalogued under a different attribution? And is the Hermeticism that shaped the Renaissance the full tradition, or the portion that someone, at some point, decided was safe to let survive? Number 9. The Etruscan Libri. You are a Roman general preparing to march. Before the legions move, before the standards are raised, you bring in a haruspex, a priest trained not in the Roman tradition, but the Etruscan one. He examines the liver of a sacrificial animal, reading its lobes and fissures against a bronze model divided into sacred regions. He studies the behavior of lightning from the night before. He interprets a flock of birds crossing the camp at dawn. Then he tells you whether the gods approve of what you are about to do. You act on his advice. Every Roman commander did. For 500 years. The haruspex is reading from the Etruscan libri, a body of sacred texts that Rome depended on for half a millennium, that Rome's own emperors studied and preserved in Latin translation, and that vanished so completely after the 4th century CE that today we cannot fully read the language in which they were originally composed. The libri fell into 3 categories. The libri haruspicini taught the interpretation of animal organs and natural prodigies, monstrous births, floods, showers of stones. The libri fulgurales addressed lightning, which God had sent it, to which region, and what response was required. The libri rituales governed city founding, the consecration of sacred space, the division of time, and the proper conduct of the dead into the afterlife. Together they formed a complete cosmological and theological system developed by a civilization that predated Rome, and that Rome, to its credit, never entirely dismissed. According to Etruscan tradition, the books had a divine origin. A being named Tages, a child in form but ancient in appearance, with the wisdom of an old man emerged fully formed from a plowed field in Etruria. He dictated the sacred knowledge to Etruscan elders who transcribed it immediately. Then he died. The transcription became the libri. Rome maintained a college of 60 haruspices, always Etruscan-born, always trained in Etruria, who served as the official interpreters of the libri throughout the Republic and Empire. Cicero discusses haruspicy in De Divinatione, written around 44 BCE, treating the Etruscan books as a genuine ancient tradition, even while personally skeptical of divination's mechanism. The Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 CE, was sufficiently serious about Etruscan culture that he wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans, confirmed by his biographer Suetonius in Lives of the 12 Caesars. Claudius's history is itself lost. The man who documented the Etruscans in the most detail failed to survive in the written record. By 391 CE, Theodosius I had prohibited pagan religious practices throughout the empire. Haruspicy was explicitly banned. The College of Haruspices was dissolved. The libri were no longer being transmitted to new practitioners. Within a generation, the living tradition was dead. What makes this loss different from the others in this list is the barrier that now stands between us and any recovery. The Etruscan language is still only partially understood. Roughly 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions survive, catalogued in the Thesaurus Linguae Etruscae, but they are almost entirely short funerary texts, names, brief dedications, formulaic phrases. No long literary or religious text in Etruscan has been found. The single most substantial Etruscan text in existence is the Liber Linteus linen wrappings reused on an Egyptian mummy, containing what appears to be a ritual calendar. It is held in the Zagreb Archaeological Museum. It survived by accident, in the wrong country, wrapped around a corpse. If Etruscan religious texts were found tomorrow, if Claudius's 20-volume history turned up in a monastery archive, mislabeled and unidentified, we might lack the linguistic tools to read everything in it. The tradition that guided Rome's military and political decisions for 5 centuries stopped being copied the moment an emperor declared it illegal. What did the Libri Fulguralis say about lightning that Rome's own priests could not replicate once the Etruscan tradition was gone? What does the Liber Linteus contain that Etruscan scholars still can't fully translate? Is Claudius's history sitting somewhere in Europe, unrecognized? And what did Rome lose not just religiously, but practically, when it outlawed the books it had relied on for half a millennium? Number 10. The Library of Ashurbanipal's Inner Vault. Around 650 BCE, the king of Assyria dictated the following words for a clay tablet. I, Ashurbanipal, within the palace, understood the wisdom of Nabu. I have studied all the arts of scribes, of every craftsman, as many as there are. I have read the beautiful clay tablets from Sumer and the obscure Akkadian writing, which is hard to master. I have examined stone inscriptions from before the flood. Before the flood. He believed he was reading tablets that predated the Great Deluge records from a civilization that existed before the catastrophe that, in Mesopotamian tradition, reset human history. He collected them deliberately. He cataloged them. He stored them in a special archive within his palace at Nineveh. And that archive has never been fully excavated. Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh is the most famous archive of the ancient world. Its existence was unknown until 1849, when British archaeologist Austin Henry Layard began excavating the mound of Kuyunjik near modern Mosul in Iraq, revealing the ruins of the Assyrian royal palace. Layard and his colleague Hormuzd Rassam recovered approximately 30,000 clay tablet fragments over the following years. They were shipped to the British Museum in London. The tablets contained administrative records, royal annals, astronomical observations, medical texts, omens series, hymns, and literature of a sophistication that transformed scholarly understanding of the ancient Near East. Among them was the Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1872, a British museum scholar named George Smith was sorting through the tablet collection when he read the 11th tablet and recognized a flood narrative nearly identical to the one in Genesis, predating the biblical account by at least 1,000 years. Smith reportedly ran into the street outside the museum, overcome, and began removing his coat. The Gilgamesh flood story proved that what seemed like the foundational origin of Western religious history had a much older foundation beneath it. What had been read as revelation was, in part, transmission. Ashurbanipal built his library through military conquest and scholarly obsession simultaneously. When Assyrian armies sacked cities, the king sent orders specifying which tablets to bring back. He dispatched agents to temple libraries across Mesopotamia with instructions to locate and copy specific series, medical texts, omen compendia, astronomical records, and what the Assyrians called secret knowledge of the great gods. His own inscriptions describe this as a personal mission. He was not collecting trophies. He was assembling a complete archive of Mesopotamian intellectual tradition, including texts he believed were older than the civilization around him. The administrative records of Ashurbanipal's palace describe what scholars refer to as a separate house of tablets, a distinct archive for the king's personal collection, specifically the older acquired material, separate from the working library used by court scribes. This is where the antediluvian tablets, the ones he described reading, appear to have been housed. Layard's 19th century excavations were rapid and stratigraphically imprecise by modern standards. The inner palace areas were not systematically documented. The full extent of that archive has not been excavated. In 2014, ISIS captured Mosul. In February 2015, ISIS fighters filmed themselves destroying artifacts in the Mosul Museum, including Assyrian sculptures from Nineveh. In the months that followed, unauthorized excavations at the Nineveh site were documented by UNESCO and the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiative's looters digging for marketable tablets, cutting through layers, undisturbed for 2,600 years. The damage to unexcavated areas has not been fully assessed. Whatever remains in the ground at Kuyunjik is in a more precarious position today than it was in Layard's time. What Ashurbanipal put in his inner vault, the tablets he believed recorded a world before the flood, remains unknown. Modern Assyriology has revealed that Mesopotamian knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, and medicine was far more advanced than scholars assumed before the tablets were read. There may be more. Throughout human history, the books that threatened power, economic, religious, political, military, were the first to burn. What we call ancient wisdom is only the fragment that its destroyers didn't find, or didn't understand, or judged too unimportant to bother with. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to keep following these buried histories. Like this video if a single one of these losses made you angry, and comment below, which of these forbidden books would you most want to read?